My name is Dr. Jody Hunt, and I am the Director of Graduate and Undergraduate Programs here at the Neuhoff School of Ministry. I'd like to welcome you to the Neuhoff School of Ministry's 21st Annual Landrigan Lecture, which is being presented this year through the University of Dallas Ministry Conference Faith Connect series. And I'd like to say a special welcome to the Landrigan family, who I know are with us this evening. Established in 1999, the Landrigan Lecture was created to honor the contributions and legacy of Steve Landrigan, who served the Diocese of Dallas for decades as a catechist, historian, journalist, and dedicated servant of the Church. Inspired by the reforms of the Second Vatican Council, especially in its call for renewal biblical studies in Catholic circles, for optimistic engagement with the modern world, and for a broader engagement throughout the Church, the Landrigan Lecture brings nationally prominent figures to the University of Dallas to discuss theological issues facing the life of the Church. This annual lecture is addressed to the university community, those in professional ministry, and educated Catholics. The Landrigan Lecture is the premier Catholic theological lecture in the DFW Metroplex. After tonight's lecture, we invite you to join us as we work toward establishing a Landrigan Lecture Series endowment. By endowing the Landrigan Lecture, this premier series will live on for decades. Gifts of any size, annual or one-time, are welcome at the University of Dallas Advancements page, which you can find at advancement.udallas.edu/donate. When making your donation, please click Other on the top-down menu and indicate that your gift is for the Landrigan Lecture endowment. Moving onward to tonight's lecture, we are so excited to welcome from Boston College, Associate Professor of Hispanic Ministry and Religious Education, Dr. Hosman Ospino. Dr. Ospino's research concentrates on the dialogue between theology and culture and the impact of the interchange upon Catholic theological education, catechesis, and ministry. He has lectured nationally and internationally on these areas and once worked for the National Confederation of Catholic Education in his native Colombia. Besides publishing numerous articles, Dr. Ospino is the author of over 14 books, including the recent Our Catholic Children, Ministry with Hispanic Youth and Young Adults. This evening, Dr. Ospino will be presenting And You Welcomed Me, a Catholic meditation on immigration and race for a changing community. Millions of immigrants from various parts of the world are renewing and redefining the core of the American Catholic experience. Immigrants constitute about a quarter of U.S. Catholic population. We live in a complex sociopolitical climate in which frequent anti-immigrant and racist sentiments prevent many from affirming the inherent dignity of every person among us. This lecture is an invitation to reassess what it means to be Catholic today in our country and a call to action to confront dangerous biases that undermine our shared experience as church and society. And with that, I hand it over to our guest, Dr. Hosman Ospino.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hunt, for this wonderful introduction. You definitely make me sound more important than I am. But it is a true pleasure to be with all of you who are participating of this lecture. And I definitely want to begin with a word of thanks to the University of Dallas, and in particular to Dr. Ted Wapham, who was the person who first extended this invitation, the Dean of the Neuhoff School of Ministry. I want to also give special thanks to Oscar Carranza, who oversees the Dallas Ministry Conference and also works at the school on as the person overseeing graduate enrollment and student services. And also Joseph Bayonat, I hope that I'm pronouncing your name well, Joseph, who's a graduate assistant and is the technology person behind this. I'm delighted to learn that members of the Landrigan family are also on this lecture. And thank you for your support. Thank you for that initiative. It is precisely Catholic families like you and supporters like you that make our universities thrive and be at the service of church and society by supporting this kind of initiatives. Thank you very much for that support and anyone else who's behind these lectures. I want to pray in a particular way, begin with a word of prayer as well, with, for all the people in Texas, who during the last few days have been struggling significantly because of the weather and the lack of electricity and the many other realities that have been affecting their lives. Let us also pray for the people who are being affected by the coronavirus, COVID-19, in the United States and around the world. We pray for the souls of those who have died because of the virus. We pray for the families that were left behind, and we pray for our society as we continue to struggle together to recover and to continue to build our society. And let us pray in a particular way for the millions of immigrants who are reshaping our society, our church, our neighborhoods. It is in honor of them that I want to deliver this particular lecture. It's a lecture that brings together the best of what I can offer, I would say, in terms of pastoral practical theology and ministerial reflection. What I'm gonna do is just to let all of you who are on the Zoom call, and also for those of you who are joining via Facebook Live and other venues, I'm gonna divide my lecture or my presentation, actually my meditation, I'm gonna divide it into 3 moments, So I estimate that each moment is gonna last, I would say, between 17 and 20 minutes. And then after each section of these 20 minutes, I'm going to stop for a minute and then, or for a few minutes, and then invite you to ask some questions, to have some reactions, but mostly questions in case that you need to clarify or you want to expand on something that I have said. The best way to share your questions is using the chat room. There's an entire team behind your computers, just collecting all these answers, these questions and these notes, and then they will formulate it in loud voice so we can engage in conversation. I promise that, I do not have all the answers, thank God, but I will do my best to share some thoughts based on what I've been discussing in this particular lecture. So the lecture is entitled, "And You Welcomed Me, a Catholic Meditation on Immigration and Race for a Changing Community." The first part of this lecture, this presentation, is I want to entitle it "On the Responsibility of Welcoming the Immigrant Sister and Brother." An opening question that we must ask ourselves when we speak about immigration is, what do we do before the presence of the immigrant? This is an eminently an ethical question. It is also a spiritual question. It's both ethical and spiritual. Notice, the question that I'm formulating here is not, what do we do with the immigrant? Which tends to be a question that often instrumentalizes the immigrant person, or treats the immigrant person as an object, objectivizes the immigrant person. So the question is not what to do with the immigrant, but what do we do before the presence of the immigrant? As Christians, we do not enter into this conversation as if we can dispose of someone because of their migratory condition, or ignore their presence, their histories, their plights. The immigrant and what this person brings compels us. The immigrant engages us. The immigrant leaves no other option to the one who encounters him or her but to respond. Consequently, the presence of the immigrant demands an ethical, spiritual response. The immigrant sister and brother thrusts us into a revised understanding of the self, of the world, and of who we are as a community of faith. In other words, our encounter with the immigrant invites us to reflect upon the anthropological, the cosmological and/or social, and the ecclesial dimensions of that particular encounter. The world, as we imagine or as we reflect about the experience of the immigrant, the world appears in front of us as a permanent borderland when we enter into the experience of the immigrant. We must begin with the realization, embracing the fact that we live in a globalized world. Ours is a generation on the move, physically and virtually. The fact that I am speaking with you tonight from Boston and addressing an audience primarily based in Texas, yet listening from different parts of the United States of America and potentially the world, reflects the type of world in which we live. We move, we transcend boundaries. People and communities are constantly crossing boundaries and sometimes transgressing them in light of their needs and in light of their hopes. Every human being is doing it one way or another, whether we do it through internal migrations within a nation, a state, a neighborhood, or whether we do it at the international level, as many migrants do it. More than 250 million people in the world at a given time are on the move, transgressing boundaries or settling after having transgressed or crossed boundaries internationally, seeking a new life, a new opportunity, or fleeing something, as we will say later on. After centuries of predominance of the global north, and by that we mean mostly Europe and North America, the global south arises. And yet, this global south arises not with imperial or colonial strategies. The global south arises, and its primary assets are people, children, youth, dreams, hopes, and needs. It's a different type of a different type of understanding of global mobility, what we are experiencing at this very moment. In the midst of this global mobility, the United States of America as a society is being reconfigured. It should not be surprised. It should not shock anyone. The United States of America for centuries has been a society shaped up and reshaped by immigrants, immigrant families from different parts of the world. So is Catholicism. Catholicism has always been an immigrant experience in the United States of America. The first Catholics in what today is the US territory were Hispanic. No, the first Catholics who celebrated Mass and the different sacraments in the United States of America had a European background. These Spanish Catholics, along with Catholics from French background and eventually English background and others, built the church in the United States of America, the church that you and I have inherited. The majority of the immigrants throughout the history of the United States of America have come from Europe. And these immigrants, until the middle of the 20th century, built the major infrastructures that give Catholicism in the United States of America its name. Colleges, schools, parishes, universities, seminaries, and social services structures, and so on. Today, particularly during the second part of the 20th century and this first part of the 21st, the majority, we observe that the majority of immigrants are coming not necessarily from Europe, but mostly from Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Once again, nations and continents, territories that are considered as the global South. In particular, we need to pay attention to what's happening with the Hispanic experience. Since the beginning of the 20th century until today, more than 100, it is estimated that more than 100 million people have, for about 100 years, it is estimated that more than 50 million people from Latin America have made the United States its home or their home. Today, there are 20 million immigrants from Latin America living in the United States. The vast majority of these immigrants are Roman Catholic, and they are injecting a new life to Catholicism, injecting a new life not only to the Catholic faith, but also to other religious traditions. What do all these immigrants have in common as coming from Latin America, Africa, and Asia? The fastest growing group of immigrants in the Catholic Church actually is not Hispanics, it's Asians. So what do they have in common? They come from the global South. They come from regions of the world that, although are full of richness, have always struggled with poverty and desolation after centuries of mismanagement, plunder, and colonialism. From the ends of the earth, from those places that many did not consider worthy, the United States as a society and the Catholic Church in this country are being reconfigured. I would like to bring to your attention a metaphor, an image, a theological image that Mexican-American theologian Virgilio Elizondo developed, and he called the Galilean Paradigm, or the reality of Jesus the Galilean. Jesus, born in Palestine, a place that was considered almost the end of the world, a place from where nothing was expected, became the epicenter of salvation. Millions of immigrants today come from places unheard of to many women and men in the United States of America, from geographies that many people cannot name or pinpoint. Many people are coming from places that were considered desolate, isolated, and they are transforming our society. So we are at the verge of a US Catholic experience shaped not by people in communities that want to recreate empires or kingdoms, communities that want to exert power that they lost one day and now long to recover. No, ours is a Catholic experience in this century that echoes more what Pope Francis called a poor church for the poor. Most immigrants and refugees are people who struggle as they did in the past. Whether fleeing from inhuman conditions or lack of opportunity, immigrants search for a future where hope is a possibility. Immigrants in general embody a vision of utopia that can enrich receiving societies and communities. When these immigrants arrive to our communities, to our borders, to our neighborhoods, to our churches, we must ask ourselves, what do they find in those societies, or in that society, or in our church, as they become present in our midst and confront us with their beings? What attitudes do we have to engage them? Do we see them as sisters and brothers? We in the United States of America cannot ignore that our nation, the land of the brave and the free, was established with the assumption that the bravery of some people did not count, especially that of women and men who were Black and Native American. Eventually, Hispanics would be treated similarly. Many from the beginning of our nation took for granted that some people, especially women and men who were Black and also other minoritized communities, were not to enjoy freedom because of the color of their skin or because of their cultural background. Many in our society bought into the false conviction that being white granted them exclusive privileges that superseded the dignity of those not deemed white, therefore making their labor, their bodies, their rights, and even their lives disposable. We have grown much as a society, thank God, and have made significant progress. However, the scars of slavery and a communal imagination that treated minoritized communities as nobodies, as no ones, remain. Many in our society and in our church, unfortunately, fail to love Black women and men as sisters and brothers, as children of God. Every now and then, when nationalism and a blinded patriotism emerge with fury, those same negative and destructive attitudes and understandings are also applied onto immigrants and refugees. We cannot ignore the anti-immigrant rhetoric and sentiments that sometimes invades our radio waves or our internet or our political discourse. Many in our society and in our church many times fail to love immigrants and refugees as sisters and brothers, as children of God. The inability to love our minoritized sisters and brothers, especially those whose skin color is Black or brown, seems like a natural sequel of a social sin that has permeated our society for centuries, even before it was established as such. When such inability is paired with actions and policies that seek to preserve it, restore it, nurture it, enshrine it, etc., then we are faced with the evil of racism. What is racism? Asks scholar Ibram Kendi. Racism is a marriage of racist policies and racist ideas that produces and normalizes racial equalities, he says in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. When we encounter the immigrant, we have the obligation to ask, what is the lens that we use to see our sisters and brothers who are immigrant? To what extent does racism is a prejudice that permeates much of our lives in our society and continue to dominate our understanding of the immigrant experience and the way we treat immigrants. Most Christians, I must say, agree that we, as disciples of the Lord, must welcome Jesus Christ. We all see and understand the fact that welcoming Jesus Christ in our lives is a Christian radical response. However, we need to ask ourselves, what kind of Christ do we welcome and how do we welcome Christ? There exists a tendency in many sectors of our Catholic tradition, and here I'm not going to speak about other religious traditions, including Christians and others, there is a major tendency in our Christian Catholic communities to idealize this particular dimension of welcoming Christ. We tend to idealize Christ the Lord and the church. There seems to be in our church, in many sectors, certain kind of docetism, parenthesis, docetism, that heresy in early Christianity that denied the humanity of Jesus, that denied the humanity of the Lord. So there is certain docetism when we speak of meeting the other in Christ. The other is Jesus, yet not necessarily Jesus. It can't be the immigrant. We are afraid that if we say that the immigrant is the face of Christ, the body of Christ, the hands of Christ, the feet of Christ, then it becomes too literal and too uncomfortable. We are afraid that we will be held responsible for such acknowledgement if we give too much credence to it. In denying the humanity of the other, the humanity of the immigrant in this particular case, we deny who Jesus is. But my dear friends, the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25, verse 35, is very clear. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. There is no way to go around. Let me stop for a moment and see if there are any questions or thoughts that we have at this very moment from the group that is joining us. And our good friend James is going to help us, Joseph is going to help us with these questions, or Oscar.
I have a question.
Please go ahead.
In all of your discussion there, I accept it, but as an example, all of my grandparents migrated to this country from Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
They went through Ellis Island. They did it legally. I never heard you use the word on the immigrant from South America, legal.
Mm-hmm.
I'm troubled by that.
Thank you. I think that, to be honest with you, nearly everyone is troubled by the idea that people would have to enter into a situation in which they become extremely vulnerable because they are undocumented or alternatively documented. So you're absolutely right. As a matter of fact, it is at the core, at the center of the Catholic teaching that every nation should be able to protect its borders, and that migration should be organized and should be under the legal paradigms. So definitely, and this is why one of the reasons we need to be more attentive to these matters and participate in conversations that would allow for better systems for people to migrate in the United States or any other nation, without a doubt. Now, the question that we need to have ourselves in the United States of America, we know that there are about 9 million people who are, quote unquote, illegal or undocumented, alternatively documented. And most of these people have been living in this country, according to the studies that have been done, for more than 20 years. So what we need to do at some point is we are confronted with them. How do we work with these communities? How do we, find ways to regularize this while we uphold, the current structures and reform those that need to be reformed? But thank you for your question.
But they're still coming over thousands every year. So don't go back to how many million are already here.
Yes, I definitely concur with the observation. And that's why we need to, eventually implement better our laws, without a doubt. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Joseph, any other questions? Wonderful. Okay, so let's see. let's move on to the second part of this presentation, and so now that we have established, this background, I mean, I want us to, one of the goals of this first part is to set a framework within which we, understand certain dynamics, and like the question that we just received, there are many other dynamics elements, whether it's legal, political, that we also need to address. But from a theological perspective, we are faced with these realities. So now, because this is a meditation, then we want to, ask ourselves, when we encounter the immigrant person, when we are invited to welcome the immigrant person, what is it exactly that we are asked? Okay. I'm going to invite you to consider the following image, and so just one second. I'm going to share with you my screen here, and there's an image that I want to share with you. Perfect. So I would like to invite you to look at this face for a minute. Okay. So let's pause for a moment. And those of you who are looking at your screens, just pause for a moment. There is nothing strange about this image. I'm not asking you, a question, a gotcha question or anything. All I am asking you is contemplate and look at this person. Who do we find there? Who do we find in this particular in this particular image? What I would like to invite you to consider is that when we say welcoming the stranger, I would like you to think, how many times have I actually seen someone who is an immigrant and stopped for a moment and contemplate what this person means, who this person is? Jewish philosopher Emmanuel Levinas used a category that has been used throughout, for several decades among philosophers, among psychologists, among theologians and ministers, the idea of the face. Allow me to borrow a much quoted image of this much quoted image from Emmanuel Levinas. In his work, Totality and Infinity, Emmanuel Levinas speaks of the face as a living presence. Yes, he makes a lot of references in his work about the physical face. But for Levinas, the face in its nakedness, the face with its contours, the face with its wrinkles and marks, is about presence. It's about who we are. It's about how we become present in the world and present to one another. The face is living presence. The face is expression. More than the physical face of the other, we encounter a presence that beholds us and demands an ethical response. Once again, have you ever met an immigrant person? Most of us can say yes, or many of us can actually say, I have seen immigrants. I have worked with immigrants. I have denigrated immigrants, or I have embraced immigrants. I have helped immigrants. But those are not the questions. The question is, have you been in the presence of an immigrant person? And what does that mean? Have you met this person face to face? I believe that this is where the core of the matter is when we speak about welcoming the immigrant. This is about having the courage, having the desire and the openness to meet this person, the immigrant person, face to face, presence to presence, expression to expression. It is easy to speak of the immigrant as an object, or as a number, or as a label. It is easy to be far removed from the immigrant experience and question, denigrate, condemn. It is fascinating to speak with politicians or pastoral leaders or advocates who live at the border between the United States of America and Mexico, El Paso, San Diego, Brownsville, to go to Arizona, Southern Texas, and other parts of the United States that are borderlands, California. And when they speak about immigration, you can tell how different it is, their approach, compared to people who are in Washington, D.C., who are far removed from the border, from the actual immigrant experience, from those faces. Or in Boston, or in New York, or in Chicago, where we see immigrants, but we still do not engage them face to face. Encountering the immigrant face to face is an invitation into contemplation. I want to dare you. I want to dare you to meet an immigrant, but not any kind of meeting, a meeting face to face. What can I do then when I meet someone who is not face to face, someone's presence? I think twice before I demonize, before I ignore, before I mistreat, before I consider any possibilities of deportation. Encountering the immigrant is an invitation into contemplation. So let us continue then with this metaphor. Let us contemplate the eyes of the immigrant. What do you see? Allow me once again to share the screen, and we'll look at the eyes of an immigrant. What do we see? Let's pause for a moment. What do we see?
Beautiful eyes.
Beautiful eyes. Thank you, sir. That's exactly what we need to see. Beautiful eyes. What do we see when we see when we see the eyes of an immigrant? We enter. Looking at the eyes of an immigrant person is an invitation to enter into the images that this person saw, the colors, the shapes, the realities that this person perceived with his or her own eyes. Looking at the eyes of the immigrant is to encounter eyes that have seen love and hate, abundance and scarcity, war and peace. Seeing the eyes of an immigrant is an invitation to witness with this person, what this person and his or her family have witnessed, perhaps for many years. These are eyes that have seen the beauty of the lands that are now left behind. These are the people who have experienced, who have seen the lands that saw them born, where they played as children, where they shared with their friends, where they began their families. These are the eyes that have seen their own children being born. And there is nothing more beautiful than to partake with your eyes, with your senses, of the moment of the birth of a child, of a new life. These are eyes that have seen their children be born and grow. These are eyes that have seen love, the body and the eyes and the face and the hands and the feet of the beloved. These are eyes that have also seen death. When I contemplate the eyes of the immigrant, the eye of the migrant, I become part of the story of this person and of all that this person has witnessed and seen. Contemplate the ears of an immigrant. What do you see? What do you hear? When we contemplate the eyes of the immigrant, we are invited into hearing their own names as their parents called them, as their siblings and friends called them in their land of origin. Perhaps in the United States of America, they are one more number. Perhaps they are undocumented. Perhaps we call them illegal. Perhaps we call them immigrants. Perhaps we call them strangers, foreigners. But those ears have heard the names, their own names given by their parents, the names that gave them identity. And in contemplating their ears, we affirm that what they have heard, that identity. Ears that heard songs and hymns that made their hearts leap. When we contemplate their ears, we partake of the rhythms that gave them life. We participate of those moments in which these women and men felt joy, as the do re mi's and mi fa sols of music created dances and created songs that gave them life. These are ears that heard words of hate, most likely, words of persecution that instilled fear in them. These are people, these are ears that in hearing hate and persecution and engendering fear, helped them make the decision perhaps to flee because they wanted to protect their children, because they wanted to protect their own lives, because they wanted a better world. These are ears that most likely have heard words of love that touch the soul, just like you and I regularly hear words of love that melt who we are. Ears that have heard about a land where hope is possible. The United States of America, in our particular case, Europe, in other cases, South Africa, in other cases, lands where we can work and see the fruit of our labor, lands where our children can prosper and be better than we are and have a better future than the one that we have had. In contemplating the ears of the immigrant, we hear those sounds, we hear those noises, we enter into their own stories. When I contemplate the mouth of the immigrant, what do I see? In contemplating the mouth of an immigrant, I witness, I can see the mouth that has learned to speak a language through which this person interprets and speaks about reality. A language that is able to proclaim words of love, a language that can also hurt, a language with which we construct reality, a language through which we relate to God. The mouth of the immigrant is a mouth that has delighted in the flavors of food and spices that characterize the folklore and the culture of the community where this person comes from. When we contemplate the mouth of the immigrant, then we partake of those flavors and those spices, making them our own. It is a mouth that drank from the streams that gave life to mountains and valleys. Just as we drink from the waters of our own lakes and our own streams, and we receive life, the mouths of those immigrants have also received life from those streams in the lands where they were born. In contemplating the mouth of an immigrant, we consider the possibility that this could be a mouth that has experienced hunger when there was no more food, when there was nothing to feed themselves or their children or their elderly or their neighbor. This is a mouth that elevates prayers to a God that does not abandon the poor and the vulnerable. A mouth that elevates prayers like incense into the clouds, into the heavens. A mouth that sings with joy and praise to the God of life. This is a mouth that now struggles to speak another language, to eat a different food, to drink from different streams, to share feelings of love and fear, to ask for directions. Living in a new land, this mouth has to reinvent itself. And so are reinventing themselves the eyes of the immigrant, the ears of the immigrant, the hands of the immigrant, the feet of the immigrant, the entire body of the immigrant. The metaphor, the face, borrowed from Emmanuel Levinas, is powerful. It's an invitation to encounter, encuentro. It is an invitation into contemplation. Let me stop for a moment and see if you have any thoughts or questions. Somebody asks, what are some practical ways in which I can love the immigrant in your own community? The third part of this presentation is going to deal with that more concretely. But let me just name one practice in concrete, and that is embrace the practice of contemplation. This is something that we seldom do. We seldom do. No, embrace the practice of contemplating the immigrant. Stop, befriend an immigrant. Befriend someone who is Black, or someone who is white, or someone who is Latino, or someone who is Asian, or Native American. Embrace someone for whom you are the other, or if that person is an other for you, and contemplate. Contemplate in silence, contemplate in conversation, contemplate in a meal. I have seen parishes. No, my own parish, as a matter of fact, is a trilingual community. No, we have a English-speaking community, no, mostly Irish Americans. We have a Hispanic community, mostly Caribbeans, and we have a Vietnamese community. And it's not easy to build community in 3 different languages. Yet, what we have managed to find moments together in which we eat together, we pray together, we laugh together, we celebrate together, and in doing so, we contemplate one another. It's not rocket science, but we have to be intentional. Someone asks, practical policies to welcome immigrants while preserving our home. Or do we need to realize that we need to come out of ourselves and welcome them? Well, that's, the one question is, uh, in that particular context, if many of our communities are structured with this idea that we are the center, we are the receivers, and someone else comes to us. The bishops of the United States of America and several other theologians who speak about immigration say that one of the best practices in welcoming the immigrant is to put ourselves in a position of being immigrants ourselves. We don't have to leave the country. We don't have to leave our homes. We don't have to leave our communities. But if we allow ourselves to be welcomed by the immigrant rather than simply assuming that the immigrant comes to ask for space in our communities, then the conversation changes a bit. Okay, let me continue with the third part of this.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
You kind of blurred together racism and immigrants, and those are not necessarily the same thing. Sometimes they are, most times they're not.
Yeah. You answer your own question. Absolutely. Yeah. They are not the same thing. They are not the same thing. No. But what we, as I explained in the beginning, in the United States of America, unfortunately, there is a grammar that shapes many conversations. And unfortunately, there is racism in our society. And very many times, anti-immigrant sentiments are framed in racist language. People, communities that are of color, Black or Hispanic, we call them brown and so on, are perceived as less than other communities. So even if we don't read certain realities as explicitly racist, the prejudice is there. The grammar of prejudice is there. But you're absolutely right. No, anti-immigration or immigration per se is and racism are not synonymous. No, they are no. But the prejudice against immigrants, when it becomes prejudice against their race or their culture or their backgrounds, because they are different from the background of people who are already established, then there is an element of racial prejudice that we need to be attentive. So, but that's a great observation. Thank you. So let's move then to the third part of this presentation, and we'll make it more practical. So right now, then we have gone from a framework, an overall framework, to a meditation per se on contemplation. What can we do? And thirdly, then we now look at what I want to propose, prophetic practices of communion for a pilgrim church, okay? Prophetic practices of communion for a pilgrim church. And I want to propose 5 practices. How do we bring this to everyday life? No? And again, the best practice, as theologians would tell you, is good theory. And the best theory is that which can lead us into good practice. Well, let's begin with practice number 1. And the practice number 1 may not seem as practical for many of you, but yet it is important. And that is, we need to understand. The first practice is to understand ourselves, an exercise of understanding that we are a pilgrim church. we need to remember that the church is not a community that was established by God or called forth by God to exist permanently in history and be established once and for all. Being church is an invitation to journey always towards God. Therefore, in our journey towards God, Roberto Goizueta, Cuban-American Catholic theologian, invites us to imagine the church not as a borderland. The church is constantly crossing boundaries, crossing borders, transgressing borders every now and then in order to bring us into the encounter with God. We, as a pilgrim church, journey through history, and we need to hear this understanding of being a pilgrim church in our catechesis, in our homilies, and our classes, and our theological formation. As a pilgrim church, we cannot forget our past as a church, where we come from, where the first Catholics in this nation came from. We cannot forget the experience of the Irish and the German and the Spanish and the Portuguese and the Italian Catholics and the many others who have become part of the United States of America. These people built communities, and they are these are communities that were established for the good of all, for the good of everyone in the nation, in the Catholic community. Catholics cannot afford, as a community that is pilgrim, cannot afford to ignore the experience of past immigrant communities. In learning what other immigrant communities experienced, we become better hosts. We become better Catholics who welcome others into our communities. So first, let's remember who we are, a pilgrim church. Two, the second practice is we are invited, as we contemplate the immigrant and the immigrant experience, to become a Eucharist, to embrace a Eucharistic spirituality. Why a Eucharistic spirituality? Because we must remember that in the Eucharistic celebration, we come together as one body. When we come to the Eucharistic celebration, there is no undocumented or documented. There is no foreign or stranger and citizen. When we come into the celebration of the Eucharist, yes, we bring our own selves as they are and as politically charged as we could be, yet we all come together as children of God and disciples of Jesus Christ. So one of the most egalitarian moments in the experience of Catholicism is the celebration of the Eucharist. And it's in pointing towards the celebration of the Eucharist in this Eucharistic celebration that we fully understand and regularly are reminded of who we are as a Eucharistic community. When we embrace a Eucharistic spirituality, we are reminded that what we bring to God in the celebration of the Eucharist is everything that we are, our experiences, our bodies, our families, the fruit of our work, the fruit of our stories, the good that we have, the limitations that we have. Everything comes and is presented as one offering by the community to God. Theologian Daniel Grudy, Father Daniel Grudy, Father of the Holy Cross, works beautifully this particular topic of a Eucharistic spirituality, in which he invites the entire Catholic community and the entire society in the United States of America to remember that in the Eucharist, which is the ultimate sacrifice, we all bring our sacrifices, including the sacrifices of the immigrant community and the sacrifices that we all make to understand ourselves as one body, into the ultimate sacrifice, who is Jesus Christ, for the life of all. 3, the third practice is solidarity with immigrants and refugees. Solidarity for a Christian person or from a Catholic perspective is a commitment to embrace Jesus Christ in the one who is vulnerable. That's where everything begins. It's the embrace of the other who is vulnerable. And when we do this, we must ask questions. Why is this person in X or Y circumstance? Being in solidarity demands that we ask about the conditions of injustice that have led millions of people to flee their homes and cross borders and expose themselves to injustices or dynamics that are negative in their lives. Being in solidarity with the immigrant demands asking questions of the governments and societies in Latin America or in Africa or in Asia or even in Europe or other parts of the world where societies, governments have not done enough to allow and help people to live with enough dignity. Being in solidarity with immigrants and refugees is an invitation to, or is a demand to ask questions as to why and how societies like ours and some of the better off societies may have created conditions that have prevented other people from growing in the same way we grow. Let's not forget that we consume more than 20% of the goods and the energy of the world. Everybody wants to be us. Everybody wants to be like us, which would be, at the end of the day, unsustainable anyway. However, being in solidarity is asking those questions. Being in solidarity is embracing the practice of Christian hospitality as a virtue, not just as a practice in which I allow and give people permission to use my community, but as a virtue that builds the common good, hospitality. And being in solidarity, once I have asked those questions, demands that I advocate for better conditions of immigration, advocate for better quality of life for immigrants and for others, that I advocate for a just order, that I advocate for treatment of the immigrant as someone whose dignity is, cannot be violated. 4, the fourth practice I want to propose is the denunciation, intentional denunciation of the sin of racism and other prejudices. The bishops of the United States of America, the Catholic bishops, in 2018, only 3 years ago, wrote a pastoral letter called Open Wide Our Hearts, the Enduring Call to Love. And the bishops in this letter invited the entire Catholic community in this country to acknowledge once again, because they had already done it several times, that racism and racial, ethnic, cultural prejudice is a sin. So we must begin by recognizing that the sin of racism is a reality, and it has many forms, many shapes, and it has many expressions in our community. And we all, one way or another, may end up actually participating of this sin that has personal and communal dimensions or social dimensions. The bishops of the United States of America in this document do a fabulous exercise that is worth actually keeping in our communities. They invite us to learn about our history and the history of our nation and discover those instances where racism has prevailed or has prevented us from recognizing the dignity of the other. I would add to their documents that we also need to learn about the history of the places and the communities where the immigrants come from. Again, we need to understand what has prevented them from flourishing, and we need to have better conversations as Catholics, nationally and internationally, about these matters. The bishops of the United States of America, in this document, in many ways, invite us to approach racism from a prophetic and mystical way, drawing from the best elements of our faith. We must denounce, on the one hand, the sin of racism, of prejudice, and on the other, we must contemplate the mystery of Christ and the mystery of the human person in the one who is racialized, and in this case, the person who is an immigrant. And the final practical commitment that I would recommend is, in our faith communities, in our neighborhoods, in our society in general, in our church, definitely, we must commit to foster the participation of immigrant voices in the life of church and society. In other words, we need to understand that when we build our faith communities and our neighborhoods, we do not build them as structures of exclusion. In other words, we build them for ourselves and those who look like us and speak like us, but we also build them for others. When the Polish and the Germans and the Italians and the Irish and many others, and the Portuguese and many other Catholics built their parishes, they built them, yes, to serve the particular needs of their communities, but as those communities evolved and the population changes, then we need to imagine others benefiting from those structures. It is a sin when a particular faith community, a Catholic church, would rather see their own Catholic church closed before it serves someone or a community that is Black or brown or immigrant. That is a sin. And that is poor Catholicism, and that is poor ecclesiology. We need to recognize that in the process of empowering immigrants and communities that are minoritized, we need to sometimes let go, allow the next generations to embrace and take on the responsibility of evangelization. Keep in mind that in the United States of America, about 42% of all Catholics in this country right now self-identify as Hispanic. About 5% of all Catholics self-identify as Asian. About 3% plus self-identify as African American, Black, or immigrant from Africa. And we have about slightly less than 1% that self-identify as Native American. So we are in a church of minorities, in which everybody has a right to these realities and to participate of the structures. We need to figure out a way of sharing those structures. And finally, we need to affirm immigrants today. We know that about a quarter of all Catholics in this country are immigrants. We need to affirm these immigrants because in affirming the immigrants of today, we are affirming the next generation of Catholics of tomorrow, their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren. Thank you very much. So And so now that, this concludes per se the lecture, the presentation, Dr. Hunt. I don't know if we want, are there any questions or how you want to move forward?
Are you welcome to taking in a couple of questions, perhaps? I think there's
Absolutely.
some in the chat that I could throw to you.
Please.
Sure. One came earlier before, I think, this third part, and it was from Stephanie Landrigan. And she asked, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. And how do we define the welcome? Could you just kind of go back over there and just like zone in on what that welcoming is?
Welcoming. Well, it's the question of welcoming, it should be straightforward. I mean, welcoming, what we could define it in a simplistic way, Welcoming means somebody owns the house and someone else comes in and you welcome that person, okay? But there is a problem from a Catholic ecclesiological perspective. And the biggest challenge is that as Catholics, the immigrant, the one who arrives, has as much right to that house as the one who's already there. You see? And that's one of the challenges that we have. I mean, because if we take welcoming in the very simplistic, traditional political way, then we begin with that, we see it in many parishes and we see it in many neighborhoods when somebody says, this is my parish. I have heard Irish American Catholics say, my parents built this church. This is our church. I have heard Portuguese American Catholics saying, this is our church, our parents built the church. I have heard Hispanic Catholics say, this is our church and our parents or our families are supporting this church. So from an ecclesiological perspective, when we read, this is why I'm inviting everybody to read these dynamics from a more ethical / spiritual perspective. When we think about belonging, welcoming, and entering into a community from a theological perspective, ecclesiological perspective, what we are saying is that we all, as children of God, own the house. We own the community. Whether you have been in this community for 50 years or 70 years, the one who just arrived yesterday, also because of that person's baptism and because of the Lordship of Jesus Christ and because of the identity of discipleship, that person in that community has as much right to be part of the church. We all are the church. So this is why, when we say, how do we speak about welcoming in this particular context? I think that the best way to say it is, I think is, let's sit down together. I think it's just, as simple as that. Let's sit down together without the pretension that one group owns the church and the other doesn't. That one group knows how to be Catholic better or more than another. But that we all are pilgrims, that we all are journeying together. And that requires vulnerability, because I know many Mexicans and Colombians and Venezuelans who want to teach everybody how to be a good Catholic. And I know a lot of white Catholics who want to teach everybody how to be good Catholic. And if that's the starting point, there will never be unity in our church. But if we place ourselves in a position of vulnerability, opening ourselves to learning from the other, that's the best welcoming that I think that we can have.
Sure. You have time for a couple more. We have one from Facebook.
Please.
And they asked, how can a second and third generation immigrants who have lost their cultural heritage, sort of builds on what you were talking about, fully experience the encounter of immigrants without the pitfalls of assimilation?
Yeah. Well, second, third generation are not immigrants any longer. So let's begin by saying that, So when we speak of immigrants, we'll say we're speaking about first generation, the group that crossed borders and arrived. Those will be the immigrants. Children and grandchildren, they are children of immigrants. You could claim an elements of the immigrant experience, But let's face it, you are as American as anybody else, born and raised in the United States. How can we reclaim? How can we reclaim elements of that immigrant experience? I think that the best way is exercising practices of retrieval. African Americans have done excellent work in doing this. Retrieving practices, cultural, artistic, religious, philosophical, literary practices from those communities that were immigrants or from away from the past, and then bringing them. But let's be honest, okay? We need to be careful. For instance, if I am a third, fourth generation Latino, for instance, and I want to bring back the Catholic experience of my grandmother, who migrated from Mexico or from Nicaragua or from Brazil, from wherever she was from, and then I want to retrieve that. Let's be careful, because there is already a historical gap, and there's a gap of 50, 60 years, most likely. And that experience, if I bring it without the correct historical adjustment, then it becomes oppressive to you, and it becomes oppressive to those and to those around you. So I think that the best exercise of retrieval is understand the practice in its own historical context, understand the experience in its own historical context, and when embracing it in the present, embrace it with a critical way, so everybody can actually grow out of that experience. But I mean, this is a more complex question, but I think that perhaps that's the closest I want to answer it tonight.
Yeah, sure. I think this last question that we have it kind of speaks to that as well. It talks about dealing with the common reality, that the vast majority of Hispanics, Latinos were not allowed to build their own faith communities like we have with the Irish and the French and the German and the Czechs. And I think we see many of that here, even in Southwest Texas. They're here, but they're not really here in their own parishes in a sense. It's in many ways, she asked, Dr. Hendry asked, in many ways, the immigrants of today are made second-class citizens who are pushed to their own liturgical celebrations, even renting, and she puts renting in quotes,
Yes.
time and afternoons, and are not fully integrated into many places. And I know I've encountered this growing up in Texas. Our Lady Guadalupe celebrations is very big here, but it does feel, I mean, I really like this question. It does feel at times, it's sort of like the Hispanic culture and the liturgical practices are sort of given this one afternoon on that Sunday, and then we don't see it again. It's not integrated at all. So could you just give us our last thoughts on, especially with the ministries, is how do we integrate them into the life of the parish where it becomes their own, and so they can take, we handed that over to them.
Yeah, the thing is that in that question, so you're gonna have to invite me to a second Landrigan lecture, because this is so big, But in that question alone, there are at least three dynamics that we need to keep in mind. On the one hand, we find ourselves correcting, the errors of the past, or the mistakes of the past, wounds from the past. That's what, and the person who asked that question is absolutely right. While European Americans were building churches in different parts of the country, mainly in the Northeast and the Midwest, Native Americans, Hispanics, Hispanic Catholics, and Black Catholics were not allowed to build as many churches. There were some de facto Latino churches in Texas and in California, Arizona, and other parts of the country, but they were more kind of, just because they were pushed, just like the Black churches. Nobody else wanted to have Black Catholics in their community, so eventually you will name the Black churches, and these communities will serve that particular population. So what we are trying to heal, decades, actually more than a century of discrimination, segregation. There was major segregation. Let's keep in mind that the first dioceses to segregate in the United States of America, to desegregate in the United States of America, do it in the 1940s, you know, so 40s, 50s. So this is, I mean, this is a history that actually permeated much of what we were doing. Now, that's the first piece, no? So we, in trying to heal history, it is, I mean, we're not gonna go back in time and ask the people, you know, the good old people, hey, come on, be nice, you know. I mean, people have ownership of their communities, and they say, no, this is the white parish, this is the Irish parish, or the French parish, or the German parish. And I think that, I mean, there's an element of good there, but as I went back to, you know, going back to the lecture or the presentation, I was saying, we need a better ecclesiology. The second point that I would say that needs to happen, that needs to be taken into consideration, is that at the time when Hispanic Catholics and Asian Catholics began to arrive by, you know, in their largest numbers, this is a time in which in most parts of the country, they don't have to build churches. Why? Because there are already plenty of those churches, no? Especially in the Northeast and the Midwest, but there are parts of the Southwest where that is the case. Of course, most of the infrastructure, the Catholic infrastructure, was built in the Northeast, Midwest, no? And as a matter of fact, we are closing churches these days, no? Because we cannot keep up with those structures. Yet, in the South and the West, you know, there is still a very small structure, sleek structure that needs to be strengthened. So I think that at some point, the Latino community and the Asian community, we need to get our act together in many ways and start building churches. I mean, there is no option. I think we need to start building Catholic schools. And I mean, some people tell me, well, Dr. Ospino, that's very expensive. And I say, well, so what? Let's go and raise the money, you know? So let's go start building those churches. Let's start building those Catholic schools. And I mean, I would like to see more Latinos funding universities, you know, founding universities. And we need to start creating and recreating all these dynamics. I think that, yes, I understand that European immigrants came at a different time when it was a different historical context, but that doesn't prevent the new generations of Roman Catholics from building infrastructure. In the Northeast and the Midwest, we don't need to build more churches, at least in most parts of these regions. We got plenty of churches. The question is, are we going to share those churches with the immigrants and the groups that need them at this point? And that's another battle that we are having. And the last point that I would say, and as I said, you know, that was a big question. The last point that we need to keep in consideration is, we need better catechesis, better homilies, better teaching about what it means to share parishes. You know, we still have a very segregated mentality in our Catholic world. I mean, how is it possible? I have traveled to dioceses, you know, where about 40% of the Catholic population or 30% of the Catholic population is Hispanic. And then I ask, you know, someone, in the diocese, or someone who invited me and said, how many parishes serve the Hispanic Catholic community? And clearly they can tell me those two parishes, St. John's and St. Mary's, they take care of the Hispanic population. And I always joke around. I said, really? Two parishes take care of 40% of Catholics in your diocese, while you have 120 parishes serving the other 60%. I mean, there's a little bit of an inequality in this whole dynamic, but we need to better train our leaders and our communities about these matters.
Sure. I think those are very good words to end on. And I would say, as someone who's involved in the formation of ministers, you're preaching to the choir, you're speaking to me. Very good. And I would say also to our audience, if you have not read a book by Hossman, Dr. Ospino, I highly recommend it, because he really gets to the heart of that, especially when you're talking with Catholic education, ministry, and youth, young adults. It's been eye-opening for me and my students. We engage in those texts. So it's been an honor to have you here this evening with us at the University of Dallas.
Thank you. It's been a true pleasure. And thank you, everyone who made this possible. So enjoy the rest of your evening then, okay?
Yes. And again, if you'd like to continue on in support of the Landrigan Lecture, you're welcome to visit the advancement page at the University of Dallas, and be sure to notate that the funds that you donate, either a one-time small donation or a lifelong donation, to notate that it is the Landrigan Lecture Series, and because we'd love to continue to invite Professor Hausmann-Orsino to visit with us at the University of Dallas. So we really appreciate you being here. Another side note is this is a continuation of a series with Faith Connect at the University of Dallas Ministry Conference. So if you would like to continue, we are continuing these conversations and other forums and other topics. Please visit our Facebook page and our website and sign up to receive more information about this and other lectures. Thank you again for having us in your homes this evening, and we hope to see you soon.